Hello everyone. My name is Ray Konopka with Ray Software, and in this webinar I'm going to be covering in detail data visualization in multi-device applications. I have plenty of material, so let's get started. First off though, I do want to provide an overview of what we mean when we say data visualization. What are various techniques involved? What is and what is not in the realm of data visualization? And then inside of that same discussion, we'll be talking about the role of infographics and vector graphics and so forth, and putting it all together. Once I cover kind of some introductory slides, there aren't a whole lot of slides in this presentation. A lot of it is code working in the IDE, and have several examples. We'll start out looking at the vector graphics support that's built into the FM framework. The role that plays when we talk about data visualization is very important, and I'll mention the differences between, say, the bitmap support for appearances of controls versus vector-based, and why vector-based lends itself very well to data visualization techniques. But we'll get to that later on. I do want to spend some time talking about charting techniques, probably the most common data visualization mechanism that's out there. We're most familiar with that. We've all seen bar charts and pie charts. One of the challenges that I get often asked is, should I be using my own? Should I be using what's included in the box? And if I do, how do I use the T-chart and make that work? So we're going to cover some of that to make sure everybody's comfortable with putting together some basic charting capabilities in their products, because it does lend itself very well to visualizing data. We're then going to move on to customized lists and data sets. Specifically, I have an application that's written for the phone. It's a ratings application, allowing you to browse a particular product and get some details about multiple versions of it, multiple brands, if you will, and be able to do a comparison between them. And so we definitely have some purpose in mind when we're looking at that particular example, and then we're going to modify that in various ways to see how we can improve the visualization capabilities of the application, and along the way learn a ton of things about the FM application framework and how all that's put together and how it works under the hood. And then wrapping up this webinar, we're going to take an in-depth look at a high-res canvas display, basically utilizing the tried and true canvas with a little twist on it, in the sense that we're in the FM framework, so it's well beyond what the standard GDI we're used to using in the VCL. We want to move to FireMonkey. What can we benefit? The real benefit that we get is we get real high resolution. We also get cross-platform, and so the application that we're going to have at the very end runs on Mac, Windows, Win64, iPad, and iPhone platforms, and so we'll be able to use this on all of those different various devices. So let's get started. So the first thing that we want to just put our minds around to start with is really what we mean when we say data visualization. The word visualization gives us a big clue, and we're really leveraging the visual systems. It really depends on our eyes. Being able to take in a lot of information visually, interpret that, and by doing so, this allows us to ask new questions, to further explore what it is we're seeing, and in the process help identify things about that data, whether it's sub-problems or whether it's trends and patterns that we're taking a look at. But there's this dual role of data visualization. You have the exploratory side, which means I'm investigating. I really don't know what I'm looking for, but I want to use a various technique in order to help me discover it. And so there's this exploration notion of visualizing some data. That's where identifying the trends and patterns really comes into play. There's also the explanatory side of data visualization. We now put on our persuasive hat, and we're trying to make an argument to someone. We're trying to convince someone. We're trying to explain to whoever our audience is, what does this data mean? We've already done an analysis. We've explored it, and we now want to present it in the most concise way possible. And there's various techniques to do that depending on the type of data that we're dealing with. So some of the various techniques, and many of these we're familiar with. We use lists and tables and labels all the time. And yes, a label is a data visualization technique. So much so that almost all of the rules that you learn about UI design, certainly from our programming days, and I've done many sessions on this, a lot of the same rules apply for data visualization. And it makes sense. You know, you're trying to present information, not necessarily just actions and tasks that are trying to be accomplished, but you want to present information. And so those same types of rules apply. You want to be clear and concise. Users come in and look at your information with certain backgrounds and conventions and so forth. You have to follow those. Otherwise, you can get disconnected from your audience. Like I said before, another technique is charts and graphs, and we see these all over the place. I think you can't open up a newspaper today and not see some bar chart or a line graph showing trends of things, and they're very effective in doing so. There's also lots of guidelines and things you shouldn't do with them, but you know, that's kind of the same thing in any UI space. But this has our bar charts, line charts, pie charts. Scatter plots also would fall into this. Those type of numerical mappings. High resolution imaging is also key to data visualization. Whether this is something is very basic as an X-ray, or now ramp it up to a CT scan or an MRI imaging, depending on what it is you're trying to convey, you know, you have to worry about clarity and whether you have the right color palette to convey the information you want to show. If you don't, it could be very high res, but you're not going to convey the same information that you would otherwise. Hierarchical types of data presentations, network diagrams and network graphs and trees and those types of internetworked presentations. We also have relational formats. These include all your flow diagrams, flow charts, and ER diagrams. They're similar to your hierarchies, but in a network diagram, but they have a slightly different purpose. You're usually not trying to just show the relationship, but there could be a transverse nature through all of that stuff that you have to be concerned with. And of course, you have maps, and we use maps all the time. This seems to be a very common approach these days for any of the geographical data that we're dealing with. We want to see a map. Gone are the days of abstracting the idea of the map. We want to show a map. You know, let's get the spatial relationships down there and show some real data. So moving forward, whenever you talk about data visualization in today's conversations, you almost always hear the term infographics mentioned at the same time. And if you asked 10 different people, you'd probably get 10 different definitions as to what they mean. But it's starting to get some generality as to what the industry thinks this term means. And generally put, it's an infographic is still based on data. It's a presentation of that data, but there's some constraints to it. First, they are almost always manually drawn. You can think you have a set of data that you want to visualize in some way, and someone is actually specifically laying that out, whether it's on a computer screen or whether it's for a big poster. The idea is that they are taking that specific set of data and they're making a visualization based only on that data. They don't really care about another set of data, only that data. The goal of the whole infographic is to be visually stunning. You want to have a very vivid, impactful representation of that data, and so there's certain things that you'll do. You don't have to worry about every possible data value that could be in this set of ranges. You know the range of values, so you can customize the way that's displayed. You don't have to worry about that pie piece that's, you know, only 2 degrees wide because it's such a small number compared to the rest. No, you know that the smallest value is going to work well with your pie charts, as a case example. With all that said, though, you're still using a very low level of data. You're not using a high volume of data. You're using a few data points, trying to convey some information, and that typically falls into that. Now, a data visualization, on the other hand, tends to be something more automated, where we use some algorithm to do the drawing. We can plug in a new data set in order to get the visualizations we want. And so it allows a little bit more dynamic nature to that. Now, the benefit of this is that we can show lots of different data sets that we're dealing with in a consistent way. A trade-off is that it's not normally going to be as visually stunning because you now have to accommodate the generalized nature of that data. You might, in one data set, you might have a very narrow band of data values, but in another set, it might be much wider. And so your presentation of that needs to accommodate for that. And then it's really important if you're trying to do a comparison between two different data sets, you have to take that into consideration. By the very nature, you tend to have a lot higher usage of data. We tend to show a lot more data points when we start talking about data visualization. What I want to work with today is really just show a lot of the various techniques and capabilities that are just built into FireMonkey out of the box. What can we do and then build on from that as we move forward in the webinar. So the first example that I want to talk about is an overview of the FM primitives. So here I have Delphi XE4 loaded, and I have a FireMonkey HD form. At this point, I'm merely interested in the primitives that are available in FireMonkey. And the reason for that is that they form the core of presenting information in the FM framework. Everything, all the controls and all the different mechanisms that we use rely on primitives to convey information to the screen. And so it's a good idea to get a good foundation of what those are. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but what I do want to do is jump down to the FireMonkey shapes, which is really the first part. There's two sets. There's the two-dimensional shapes and the three-dimensional shapes for the corresponding layouts. But what I have here is just two simple layouts of primitives, one showing what you would consider a bar chart. And again, each one of these is individual controls, but they're related to a layout. I also have 4 different pie shapes, and the pie piece, the T-pie, is another primitive in FireMonkey. And so I've dropped all of those onto a layout control, which you will use constantly inside of FireMonkey. And if you're not familiar with it, you got to get familiar with it. It's really a cool way of managing the positioning and the flow of information when we're putting information together, and we'll see a lot of use when we get to our custom list example. But in this case, all I did is I dropped the pie shapes down for each one of the pie pieces. I aligned it to the client of the chart, and I altered the fill property. And one of the things you'll remember is all of the primitives have the core pieces, the core attributes to change their appearance. So unlike a label, the T label that's in FireMonkey, there's not much you can do with it. You can change the text, of course, but the way it looks, it's very limited. The text primitive, though, which the label uses behind the scenes, is what gives you the capability to do all the different changing. You can do a fill, you can do gradients, all this stuff, which is very powerful. Well, it's because the pie class is just a primitive. It's got a fill property that we can set up gradients on, and we have a start angle and end angle, and all I need to do is control that. So in a very simple way, you could dynamically create a new pie chart simply by dropping out for each segment you want, drop a new pie piece into a layout, and change the angles according to the size that you need. Not the best solution out there, but what I like about this is that this is a really powerful infographics approach that a lot of people don't realize. If you remember, most infographics that are one-offs, are done by graphics software like Adobe Illustrator and Corel Draw. They're all vector-based drawing programs. And so the benefit of that is that they can produce all of that. They have all the different techniques to lay out pie charts just like this in a very similar way. They would use a pie shape, lay out the controls, and what's really cool, unlike the VCL, is that because it's graphics based, it's all scalable. And so if I don't like this particular size, I can resize it and scale it to what I need, and everything is in relation to that. And so you know, again, this is about as far as I'm going to take this particular piece, but I want to make sure that everyone's aware of what you can do with these primitives. It's like a little graphics program in your application. Now, with that said, one of the techniques that you may wonder about is like, well, what if I have a complex shape? You know, that's one of the benefits of vector graphics software is you can do that. Well, if we want to leverage something like that, we can use the t-path. And so the t-path, and I actually put that into my pie there. Remember, in FireMonkey, everything can be the parent of something else. And so my example here is, I often guess, well, how do I use a path? Well, most examples you see do it programmatically. Well, I wanted to come up with a better way to do that. And so I actually used a graphics program, CorelDRAW in my case, and I went and I created some scalable vector graphics files. And one of them is I have here, and we're going to see these, what these, all of them look like a little bit later. But if you create or get an SVG file and you look at it, it's an XML based type file that we're used to seeing, but you might be wondering, well, okay, well, what do I do with this? Well, inside of the path class, there is a property called data. And if we open that up, we get this edit box, if you will, a memo. What are we going to put in here? Well, unfortunately, you can't just put in the whole SVG file. That would be kind of cool, but it doesn't work that way. Instead, you have to find the metadata section with the actual data, the path itself. And you can skip over the class, it's really informational, and find this entry for D. So D equals, and then if you copy everything from the start, after the starting quote to the end of the line, copy that to your clipboard, and we'll switch back to Delphi and paste it inside of here, your shape will now, the path comes in. Now, what's cool about this is that this shape is transparent. It's got a hole in it. And so you can have very complicated shapes inside of your presentation. And we're going to use this exact shape, and you'll see why as we get further in the example. But I just want to make sure everybody's aware of what you can do with these primitives. As I mentioned at the beginning, charting is one of the most common ways of visualizing data, bar charts, pie charts, etc. And so I want to spend a few minutes and talk about the charting capability that's included with Delphi. Specifically, T-Chart Lite by Stima Software is included. And even though it's a light version, there's a lot of capabilities that are present in it. And so, however, I do want to spend a minute or two talking about it because I often get asked, what do I need to do to customize the display? Because if we drop a new chart down, you start to see that this kind of looks dated. This is back, Windows 95, 2000 timeframes. We're not really seeing a nice flat style, nice coloring, and so forth. And so we can easily fix that, but we need to go through and edit the chart. And so we're going to take a look at what these properties are. And fortunately, it's relatively straightforward if you know where to look. So first thing we want to do is open up the editing chart dialog and add a new series to give us really what type of data we're looking at, and also give us some samples to work with. So we're going to pick a bar chart, and we can pick the opera color, which is the default right now. Go ahead and click OK, and you can see that we have this kind of old looking style. And so the first thing that we can do is go to the 3D tab and get rid of the third dimension, so we don't need to worry about that. We can go into the walls side and remove the walls, and that gets rid of the box around it, unless you want that. But if I'm trying to mimic the same example, that's what I'm doing. Next up, we go to the panel, and you'll notice that the coloring is a slightly bit different, and there's this border around it. Well, that's in the panel side, and then we can pick the default color, which will pick up the parent's color, and then we can go to border and change this to be none if we want to completely get rid of that. Again, there's, as you can tell, lots of properties all throughout this whole component, but very powerful for us to show some data. Go ahead and select visible to get rid of the legend, gives us some more data. Now these little marks up here, We can go into those in just a minute, but next up, if you go into the titles, and I am working bottom up just because it seems to be a little bit easier to remember, and you can type in bar chart example, and then you go to the format page and then select text. There's a whole lot going on, and we can go and change the coloring, get a slightly different color, and then change the size, and it adjusts it, and that's nice. We can see how it's going to look like on the page there. We can keep going, change some of the axes and all of that stuff that I'm not going to worry about right at the moment. We can go now. At this point, we're fine for all the general stuff. Really, now we need to go into the series. And so, if we select the series itself, you actually have to open that up and select it. And then from here, we can go into the marks. And so, the marks is really what those little numeric values. And if you want to show those, you can, and you can get rid of the box around it, which is really, in essence, what the pie chart is doing. And so, once you've set that as the way you need it, you can go ahead and close that, and there's a little bit of a focus issue, but we didn't lose any of our data, and we have the same thing, so we can add the labels around it. Now, one of the things I also want to show very quickly is when you're dealing with the T-chart, you deal with series. A series of data, and depending on the chart you're looking at, the data series varies. So down in this example, if we look into the form create, we load the bar chart and load up the pie chart. That was sample data that does not get loaded when we run the application. It's just there as a preview. We still have to load it, and so for the bar chart version, we can use the series 1, which is from that bar chart, and call add array to add a bunch of values, and it will just increment the x-axis by 1 and then give you a value. So you can get a nice distribution there. For the pie chart, you give it some value and you give it some label. And this example here is from a USA Today snapshot that they like to do. And in this case, what it talked about was the most common neighbor disputes. And so you got noise, property boundaries, pets and animals, and so forth. And the chart's nice that it actually will take some value, add them all up, and then figure out what the fractional amount is. The nice thing, or the one thing to remember when you're talking about pie charts, is that they're good for relatively small data sets. You don't want to go very large. And they really need to represent something out of a whole. And so that's kind of the comparison level for it. You can do the same thing with a bar chart. It's just a different way to present it. One thing to keep in mind is that people will actually have a better job of comparing rectangle sizes than they do anything that's circular. So circular arcs and things like that can take a little bit of time. This is definitely something you would see more in a data visualization. I'm doing sales figures and things like that. This might be something in an infographic. I can still do both in my FireMonkey applications. It's nice that I have the benefit to do that. Next up, we're going to take a look at a mobile application for looking at product ratings. If you're familiar with the Consumer Reports magazine and website, you know that it's an agency, nonprofit, that will review all kinds of different products in a particular genre and then do comparisons on them. And they are wonderfully adept at presenting that information in a variety of ways. And one of the common ones that they use is they do side-by-side comparisons of multiple products and give you an evaluation of them. And there's an overall score value as well as individual category ratings, and you can look to see how they compare and maybe make a decision. And it's not always the one that's at the top of the list is the one that gets the Consumer Reports Best Buy. It might be something a little bit lower because the top item is very good, but it might be very expensive. So it's a way of analyzing this. But it's a great way of showcasing some of the capabilities of the FM framework in a mobile situation. So let's switch over to Delphi and take a look at what we have. So my particular example, I'm already have it set up to review food processors. So these are the little Cuisinarts and other types of kitchen appliances that you see on your cooking shows. And so it has some wonderfully rich data that we want to investigate, and something that we want to do conveniently on a mobile device. We're out in the store, we want to pull up the, our reviews and see, okay, what does this look like? So to start, the structure of it is pretty straightforward. I'm building, obviously it's an iOS application. The layout I've got now is for the iPhone. Let me bring in my default view so we can get some structure things here. Really just one main form. There's not a whole lot going on to this piece, but this could be part of a second view where the first view would actually get me to the product category that I want, and then I can jump into here. But for sake of demonstrations, the techniques, this is what I want. So very simply, way it's made up is I have a list box with a list box header. And if you select your list box and you right click and add item, you can see the list box header item, and it automatically adds that to the list box for you, which is nice and convenient for us to do that. And of course I could dynamically change the titles and so forth. The key thing that I also have is a client data set with my data values that I've used. Now this could be through a REST call, data snap server, whatever way I want to get the data, but for here I've just got a little local client data set. The focus isn't getting the data, the focus is presenting the data. And so with that, let's take a look at what I want to do, and that is I need to take a look at the code. So let me go back to my code view here, and we'll go back up to the top. There isn't a whole lot in this class here. We've got the load the ratings does all the real work, and then we have some style things in here. So to start, we are definitely leveraging styles. I want to have not just the name of the product and some text next to it. I want it structured, and I want to build onto this. And so the first thing that we have is a whole bunch of style entries. Now where are those defined? Well, if we look at, I've dropped a style book onto my form, and I've got two styles. I've got one called a ratings list item, and another is a ratings header item. And so for the first item in my list, I want to give details about what I'm looking at. And you may be wondering that, well, that looks awfully long. There's a lot of data there. And my phone was vertical. It was in portrait orientation. Well, we're actually going to handle changing this to accommodate that. So if you rotate, we want to be able to hide some of the columns that we would feel may not be as necessary. The ratings details, we have a brand and model display, the cost of it, the overall score that the reviewers at Consumer Reports did, along with these categories. And we saw in the headers there the chopping capabilities, slicing, shredding, etc. And once we've created this, we can put anything we want into those headers, and we can even dynamically add things to those headers if need be. So the first step is to lay this out. And a couple things that I highly recommend doing, that you're going to want to do when you start doing a lot of style manipulation inside of FireMonkey, is you need to get Marco Cantu's little add-on to be able to edit this as text. And so because there's certain things that you can't always change. There's still some refresh issues, so if you make a change to something, you may not see it right away until you close it and come back. Other capabilities, the text is nice, because right now if I close this and were to view this as a form or as text, the style book is in binary data format now, which is efficient, but it doesn't really lend itself to being editable. And so if we go back to the form and you select this, Marco has added a little expert you can download from Code Central that gives you the ability to edit that resource style book as a string. And what I typically do is copy this to the clipboard and open it up into my little editor, and then I can make some tweaks and changes in there, and then just copy it back into here and apply them. Trust me, it's a fast, easy way to manage some of the styles. Another helpful hint, because every time I get back into this, I always forget it, is that when you work with the styles and you get to a point, it's like, well, I don't need that style element anymore, and you can't right-click and get anything. You can select things, and you can't right-click inside of there. To delete it, you have to use the little delete button that's up in the toolbar here. So my little helpful hint for managing some of the style settings. Some other things to think about when designing a list style, specifically for the mobile and for any list, whether it's a desktop app and so forth, is the use of layouts. And that actually, this is several iterations that I have gone through this. Even this is Ratings version 1. Whereas to get the effect that I wanted, really the use of layouts was key. Rather than just put down the text element itself, I have the text inside of a layout. The reason for that is that it gives me more control over positioning of the text inside that column. Because that's essentially what I'm trying to create here, is I have a set of columns that I want to reproduce in multiple items. So using the layouts as a column organizer is much easier to manage. Likewise, I've got layouts within layouts to manage the brand model, and the brand model is the thing that varies in size. Dynamically, I changed the width of the overall score to accommodate portrait versus landscape as well. So this is giving an idea of the styles. You can certainly take a look at all the source code that's included with this, but now let's take a look at what the code does with that. So the things that I want to be able to control, I need to put data into those list items. And so that's why I have these constants to help me make sure I reference the right style element. Because if I try to get a style element that I mistype the name, then it won't find it and it won't work right. So I tend to do this in a lot of my styles, is create constants to get into those, so I know that the contract is going to be established by my own code, let alone someone else that's using it. So load ratings does all the real work. So the first thing I do is I clear the list, and I'm going to create a new item. The first item I'm creating is just the header. There's really no data in it. All the data that I need is inside the style itself, which is fine for this particular example. The key things, though, is I'm doing some extra work with this style. Whenever it gets applied, I want to do some extra things. I need to hide and show some columns based on the orientation of the device. So I'm going to hook into the onApplyStyle lookup event. And then after I've set that up, I assign the style that I want to use for the header, which is the ratings header item style name. The next set is to iterate through my client data set, and for each record in there, I'm getting a bunch of data. So I get the brand and the model, the cost, the score, and then I have all these different values. Now, one of the things that I often see is code that will check to find the resource name of an item and then navigate through the tree of the style and actually modify the list code itself. And there's some problems with that, because as you have longer lists of items, some of the data can actually, the list items either get reused or they aren't pointing to the item you think it is. And we want to get the actual data into the item that we need. And that's the role of the styles data property of your item. And it's done as a variant or a t-value, that you can take any data that you want, you give it the name of the style name that you need, and it applies whatever you pass to it or set it. There's a data property to it. And a reason I bring this up is that when we get to ratings 3, this is important to make this work even more efficiently. And so here we're taking the value from our client data set and just putting it into the appropriate value that particular style element can use. So for a text field, it's going into the text part of it. And it's smart enough to know that, oh, I'm passing it an integer, but because it's going into a text field, it converts it to a string and puts it in there. Likewise, and well, I guess they're all text, so that's pretty much what it's just doing in all of those. That gets all the items in the list. The next step is, because those items are using the list item style, I hook into the same on-apply style lookup, and here is where we're going to hide and show the various columns that we need. So skip over the little helper function here for the minute, and we're going to get the list box item that is passed to the event handler. So this item is being worked on and being styled. I check to see if the form is in portrait mode, and down below we have the code that does that. It's a function that we wrote. We access some services and we can get that data. From there, we can, depending on the orientation, we want to change the overall score's width. If it's in portrait, we want to make it smaller. If not, we can take up some more room. Continuing on, by using the layouts, I want to hide and show various layouts. And one of the things that this is doing, and this will, anybody who's used the VCL for a long time and alignment, you know that if you have several controls aligned in the same direction, AL right in this case, and you hide one of them and then make it visible again, it's possible that the control gets out of order based on the the Z order that it was put in, as well as the position of it and how it manages it. And we've all worked around that. Well, you still have the same kind of situation. So we end up hiding all of the columns that we have, these various layouts for the different settings, and then we re-enable them based on whether we're portrait or not for 3 of them. So we're going to hide 3 of them if we're in landscape mode, or in portrait mode, and we'll show them all if we're in landscape mode. The key thing to note is that it's opposite. So as I hide them, I bring them back in the opposite order the way I want them to show, and everything works great. So it's a little helpful hint to make things appear correctly. So to get whether or not our orientation is portrait, we can use this little wrapper function. If we go to the end of it, it's using the shared application status bar orientation. There is an orientation service that you can subscribe to that's part of the iOS framework that allows you to get the angle of tilt and so forth, which is great if that's what you need. In this case, I just need to know whether it's in landscape or portrait mode. I don't need the resolution of that. And so let's take a look at what this application does. And so go back to my default layout and see that I've got it set up to the simulator, and I've already set up my PA server and everything, so I should just be able to go ahead and run this. So here's the simulators running. We've loaded up our client data set into the list box, and we have our list of data. And you can see that we've got our slicing, pureeing, and grading values. And really all the values are numeric. They're just a number. We have an overall score, which really it's how this is sorted, is by the overall score. But then I have all these numeric values that, while if I knew what that meant or could somehow gather some information, it might be useful. But it's kind of plain. I really want to add some more visualization to this, and that's really what the next step is. So can we do something a little bit more to make this convey the information we want and allow the customer, the user, to extract some information more appropriately? So let's go ahead and close this, and we'll switch over to rating number 2. So let me close this down so we don't get confused. We'll bring up ratings number 2, and yes, it looks exactly the same. However, if we go into the style, because that's the first thing that I want to look at, and we notice that we have a lot more things in the style. We have these rating levels. And the rating levels, and if you're familiar with consumer reports, you recognize these. You've got different levels. So a rating of 1 is a black circle. A level 2 has an open top. Rating level of 3 is an open circle. Rating level 4 has a red, it's a closed or open bottom, and you've got your rating level 5, which is the highest. And they're generic in the sense that what it means can be, poor to very good. And again, ratings tend to be, they're used in comparisons. By itself as an absolute, probably not much you're going to get from it. But when you compare it to others, works very effectively. What's nice about this is that these are very visual and clean imaging that we can use when we have lots of data. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. The header is exactly the same. We've got a slight difference in the items itself. These don't look much different, but the overall score certainly looks different. And if we navigate into our structure here and we look at the overall score, one of the things that you'll see is that I now have, rather than a text field, is I put a progress bar. So, well, that doesn't look like a progress bar. No, not really. It kind of does, but what I've done is I've gone into that particular element and changed the style lookup to be the ratings score bar. Well, what's that? Well, that's another item that I created in the style that I'm going to plug in place of the normal style that is used for a progress bar, because it's pretty close to what I need. I want to show a bar that from 0 to 100 that represents the score. And the progress bar was pretty close to what I needed. So I just took out the text, put in the progress bar, and now I want to manipulate the look of it. And so to do that, I created a new style. And the new style is pretty straightforward. It just has a track, and it has this thing called an H indicator, and then I've got a score value inside of it, which in an ideal world would work, but it doesn't, and I'll explain why in a second. These have to be named H-track and H-indicator. And the reason for that is what the progress bar looks for in a style that you tell it to use. So if I name these differently, those elements, if I called it just regular track or indicator or score, it would not, the progress bar component would not find that element and wouldn't be able to display it appropriately. And so whenever you're customizing a style, you have to make sure you know what those contract values are. What are the style elements that a control is indeed looking for? And that's what we have for the progress bar. Now, I had mentioned that I had ideally thought of having inside here the score itself, a numeric value that showed me what the score was. However, the progress bar doesn't support the score, doesn't support the text. And while I could probably hook into and modify the style as it applied it and plugged it in and gave it the value, it's not really something I want to do just because it gets real cumbersome, and there's a better alternative for ratings number 3. So we'll save that one for later. The next thing that I want to make sure I cover is inside of the label here, or inside each of the columns, I changed the control from a text primitive to a label control. Why did I do that? Well, the reason is that text primitives cannot be styled. However, a label control can be. So the whole point for me to get my little circles in here instead of the numbers, I needed a way to apply a style. So that's why I replaced those with labels. So that's the structure that I've had, and yes, it takes some time to lay it all out, but hopefully the effort will be worth it. And then in ratings 3, we'll try to fix it to make it even better. So let me go ahead and close this. And one thing, I will show the horizontal orientation in this example. I could have shown it before, but I just skipped over that. So let me activate my Ratings 2 application and give this a run. Again, I'm going with the simulator. So the simulator starts up, and what we'll see is immediately there is a big difference in the display quality of the data. Now, I don't just see numbers. Numbers
users, will read over those and they don't necessarily pick up the nuances. What does it mean between a 2 and a 3? You may not have discovered that quite easily, or a 3 and a 4. But when you visualize it in a very clean way, you now see, whoa, okay, now I'm starting to see why those other items are at the top of the list and some of these other ones are down at the bottom. And so we not only have the score representation in a bar, but these indicators, very effective. And I'll use the simulator to change the orientation. And so what we can see is that we now have all of the column data, the overall score values longer, we don't word wrap the title, and we can see all this extra data. So again, there's a lot more criteria that's in the display. So now that we saw what it looks like, let's look at the code behind the scenes that makes all this work. And so, because there's some extra things that we needed to do here. First, we have the same settings before. I did have to change the text elements to be labels now, as well as the progress bar for the overall score. We still load the ratings. Pretty much the same. Let me close off some of that extra stuff there. The heading goes in the same way. However, when it comes to the data elements, there's some extra things that we have to do. Remember, we had just labels as each column, each rating value. Well, I want to put in a different style, but I don't know which style to use until I know which data value needs to go into that column. It's not like they can all be black circles. I have to dynamically change that based on the value. So to do that, I've created a little helper function that allows me to do that. So I set the data value into the label. Now this will set the text property of the label with the value, which is fine. I can use that as the store to know which style I need to look up. So if we jump down to the update item style, which is down below, we'll come back up to that in just a second. So the update item rating, what it does is it tries to find the style name, which is the control that I specified, from on that list item. So I'm going to try to find the label chopping field. And if I find it and it is indeed a T label, then I can go ahead and change its style lookup to rating level whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And this is why I needed to switch to a label, because I can use the style lookup to bring back that value. So cool, very powerful way to manipulate that. The other routine that I had in there was handling the apply style lookup, and that is done the same way. Everything else is exactly the same as we did before. We hide the columns when we're in portrait mode. However, one thing that we do at the end is that we do need to reapply the styles if we switch it. So, because it could get reapplied when we change the orientation, and so we're going to make sure that we update them appropriately. And so it just makes sure that the display's done correctly. So I mentioned before that there's a ratings 3. This is ratings 2. It's pretty cool. However, it's very tedious. There isn't a whole lot of reuse. If I want another application where I want to use these same kind of ratings, there's got to be a better way. And so really that's kind of the next step in all of this is let me go back to my default layout. And we have a ratings 3. Now ratings 3, I'll close that page. We'll bring this one up and we'll open that up. Ratings 3, if we open up the style, doesn't have any of those other style elements. It's just back to the item style and the header style. However, when we open up the item style, and you've already seen it, we have the symbols already in there. And we have a fancier
overall score bar with a little background color and even has the actual numeric value on the display. But they're not anywhere in the style. Well, they are. They're just not defined here. If we go into the items and we open up the ratings, and let's just look at the chopping version, instead of a T label or a T text, it's now a TRK rating icon. And a TRK rating icon displays ratings. It knows the 5 different values that it has, and based on that will display the appropriate look. And I'll show how I built that in just a minute, but each one of these controls is set up that way. Likewise, the overall score now has a score bar, a TRK rating score bar control. Another control that I made that I can now reuse in my applications. So what's nice is I've gone back to creating a layout that's much simpler. It's more back to like the original version in Ratings 1, but has a much richer UI. And so now if I go ahead and look at the code for it, we can see that even that's been simplified a little bit. I changed my style elements that I need to modify. I still need to get the data into them, but then loading the data is back to being straightforward. All I do is I assign the data from the field. Let me go back into my code layout here, get my integer rating values, and just assign that to the style element. It knows how to do the rest. So I don't have to do any manipulation of the style lookup dynamically. The control does it. And so then applying the style for the display, that's exactly the same as version 1. I've changed out hiding the columns is done the same way, and that's it. And so if I go ahead and run this version, so running ratings number 3, we now have a new display. Actually, it's even more refined than the first one, or the middle one, I should say. We still have all the indicators, but we're not having to dynamically change that in our code. It's a reusable solution. It's running on an iOS device. Same code can run on any of the platforms. There was nothing in the definition, as we'll see, that ties it to one platform or another. And we even have our text back, the labels to tell us what the actual score is. And so now we have a much cleaner display, even better than we had in the second one, and got reuse out of it as well. So in the last example I have for today is I'm going to be leveraging the canvas in FireMonkey to display some high-res imaging, and specifically the Mandelbrot set. And many of you probably have seen it over the years. Back when I was an undergrad, a few years after it became popular, I had done some research on it, and fractals in particular, and ended up wrote some programs to investigate it, explore it, and I remember they were very cool and very stunning imaging, but kind of limited with the palettes back in the day, and the processing took forever. I mean, it was good 20 minutes on a fast machine to even get a simple image, and boy, what a difference a few years makes in the computing world. And so, however, I thought this was a great way to showcase some of the capabilities of the FireMonkey canvas. A lot of people think, oh, it's T-Canvas, it's just like the one that we're used to in the VCL. Well, not really. There's actually quite a few differences, which is a good thing. It has a lot more capabilities that we can leverage from it, but we have to know what those are and what ways we need to manipulate that. On top of that, I really wanted to make an app that covers all the different platforms. So I wanted, Win32, Win64, of course. I wanted Mac OS, leverage the speed and display capabilities of it. So on the Mac desktop. I also wanted to leverage the mobile devices. We could put this on a phone, put it on an iPad. High resolution Retina displays. Let's leverage this as best we can. So what I've started with is I have an app here, a form, and I'm going to show the desktop version first. Just to kind of get things grounded. It's a little bit easier to debug, and when you're developing things, to do it on the desktop side. You still use all the same FireMonkey techniques, but you're not having to farm out to the Mac and going out to your device or run the simulator. Sometimes it's a little faster. So I tend to will do both. Now,
one of the things you might be wondering is, well, did I have to create, share, the same code and duplicate it in both spots? And no, and that's one of the strengths of this. So my structure is pretty straightforward. I call it Mandel-Fire, and we've got a display area, which is really just a paint box. And so I'm going to put my imaging inside the paint box. The paint box gives me access to a canvas. And if you recall, there's a calculation that's involved. It's in the complex number plane. And you go through lots of iterations to figure out whether a particular complex number goes off to infinity or stays bounded close to zero. So we're going to we'll do all the math. It's not real hard, but the visualization of it is very cool. So the structures, I have a layout and I have my paint box. That's pretty much it. Now, if I look at my form for my iPad, I actually have the same setup. It's just doing the iPad version. And so I've got my paint box here, and I've got my panel with some buttons and displays. So structurally, that's pretty much the same. Now, the way, if we look at the code for this, and we go into the form create, you can tell there isn't a whole lot of code here. Most of the work is done in what's called the Mandelbrot generator. So I'm doing some timing, so I leverage the T stopwatch control, which is portable, which is great. So, system level things. Look to the RTL that gives you access to the various services that are there. Stopwatch is a great way to get high precision timings across your platforms. So rather than try to go with the the query performance counter like you would on Windows, that doesn't exist on the Mac or iOS. The stopwatch encapsulates that for us. So create that, and I create an instance of the generator, the Mandelbrot generator, and I give it the display size for my paint box. I don't really need to do anything other than give it the size that I want to use, the physical size of the canvas. And then we're going to generate the Mandelbrot set. What does the Mandelbrot set do? Well, it updates some viewport status. It updates some labels that says, okay, here are the dimensions, the real complex dimensions that are bounding the calculations. And then I reset the stopwatch, start it up again, generate the new set. Once that's done, I record the stop, turn off that I'm generating the set, and I update some fields. And then I call to repaint the display. Well, the display itself is, if I'm generating a set, I don't worry about updating the display because it's still working. I then get a bounding rectangle of the height of my area, which is coming from the generator because it knows the size of the paint box. And I simply call canvas.drawBitmap, passing it the bitmap property of the generator with a bounding rectangle, and this is the opacity level. However, one of the things that you have to do is be sure to call, whenever you work with a canvas in FireMonkey, call begin scene and then end scene around all of the calls that you are going to make. There are draw rectangles and fill rectangles and other types of capabilities. I'm using draw bitmap. Regardless of that, I would end up doing the same setup. To do the zooming, of course, you can't do a Mandelbrot set without being able to zoom. And so in this case, we're going to be able to zoom in. We update the selection rectangle, which is, if you recall, this little thing down here. And what's kind of neat about it is that it's already set up to do alpha blending. And so we just leverage that to get a little bit of fancy display by just manipulating a rectangle. Again, vector-based graphics, alpha blending, all that stuff's built in. Alpha blending, vector graphics, all that stuff is built in. So on the up, after we've selected the bounds, we simply recalculate the zoom factor and then regenerate the new Mandelbrot set. And then we can go to reset it. We simply call reset the viewer and regenerate. Pretty straightforward. The iPad version, if we look at its code, is exactly the same. There's just there's obviously some differences in the layouts and in the different controls that are used for a Mac version or an iOS version, but we still call canvas display. We still do the manipulation, the Mandelbrot set exactly the same. So much so that you could actually take the desktop version of the FMX file and add it to your iOS project, and it would work. Now, what you don't get is you don't get the fancy iOS iPad frame around it and the other ancillary things, because in the FMX file, when you create a mobile app, there's some extra settings that the designer looks at to give you these extra features. But it is exactly the same, code for code. The work is all done in the Mandelbrot generator file. And even that's not much. There's one thing that it creates a viewport, which really is a stepping stone for doing a stack, which I didn't have time to fully implement yet. I want to be able to go back in zoom levels and then rezoom. And so to get started with that, the bounding values I store off and I keep record of those. The generator class itself does a couple key things. When we generate it, it manages a bitmap that stores the current image of the Mandelbrot. Likewise, it has all the other characteristics of the max iterations and the coloring and so forth. And then the real work is all done in the generate function. And so if we look at the generate, what it does is it does the math. And I'm not going to go through all the steps in here except for just a couple important pieces with respect to the bitmap. So the first is when we whenever we want to manipulate the pixels of a bitmap. If you note, there is no pixels property when you reference a bitmap. It doesn't exist like it does on the VCL side. So in order to resolve that, we have to map the bitmap data into a local data pointer, if you will. It's a reference to a t-bitmap data. So because the Mandelbrot set is all just generating the pixels for the image, we're going to map with read and write access, because we need to modify the bitmap data. Now, if we just wanted to read it, like we were scanning the scan lines, we could just do the read here, but we want to do both. We then get a reference to this. If this returns back true, we have a successful mapping, we can now perform the calculation, which isn't all that complicated. We simply iterate through every pixel in the display, go through our calculations, and then based on the iteration count, we come up with a value of k. And k is going to tell us which color we should be coloring this particular point on the screen. And so we're going to set we call bitmap data set pixel with the coordinates and a reference to an alpha color, a color value that is indexed. We have this color palette array that I've created, and I haven't shown that yet. This tells us what color it is. Well, what's the color palette? And then finally, when I'm done with manipulating the whole bitmap, I can unmap my bitmap data object. So that's why it's in a finally. We want to make sure we do that. Now I can do anything I want with that bitmap. Move it along. Now the color palette's interesting. If we scroll down a little bit more, we're going to see how to initialize the color palette. And the color palette gives the Mandelbrot set its characteristics. That's the important piece. We want to make something that's really powerful. Now, you could pick one or two colors, and those you've seen before. Those are the real choppy. There's hard lines between them. But I wanted something more gradient, more gradual. But I also wanted multiple colors. I wanted it to pop. Well, to do that, I ended up using a couple other bitmap techniques. One, leveraging the gradient support that's built into FireMonkey. And so to do that, I create a gradient. And then I'm going to initialize that gradient with some colors. I'll show that in a second. But again, a gradient gives you a start and a stop color and all the colors in between. And then you can have multiple colors and the variances. Once I do that, but the next thing I wanted to do is populate my array of those color values. So rather than try to calculate all of that, I create a temporary bitmap. And I use the gradient to fill the bitmap. and then go through the bitmaps pixels and populate my palette that way. And so again, because I'm manipulating bitmap data, I need to call begin scene. So I get my gradient, call begin scene, I fill the entire canvas with this gradient. So I have to set the fill property of the canvas to the gradient I want, and then change the fill kind to be BK gradient. And then I can call fill rect with these settings, and this is various values, the corner size, if I want a rounded rectangle or not. I want all corners, and then no alpha channel support, and just fills it. And the scene, and then from there I now do another map to a different bitmap, my local bitmap with my bitmap data, and call a function called scanline to alpha color, which allows me to get the entire scan line and put that into my color palette. And then I override the first color palette entry to be black because that's what's inside the set, and free that up. Now what's interesting to note is you have to have an H value that is greater than 8. If you don't, I originally had this set as 1. All I needed is 1 pixel, 1 row of data. On the iOS side, that doesn't work. You don't get any data. You have to have it at least 8. It's probably a byte alignment issue, so forth, but I have it set to 10 because I was writing it out to a file to confirm it was all working. The other thing to note in the gradient is that I originally had 7 points of gradients to go through the variations. On the iOS side, there's only 4 that you can use. And so when I first did this, half my colors were gone. And so I make an accommodation to change the color values and only allow 4 points, basically a start, 2 middle points, and an end, and allow that to work. So without further ado, let's give this guy a little run. And go back to my default layout, make sure I've got the right one set up. And we're going to run the desktop version first. And here we have Mandel-Fire. And so this is, again, using the color palette that's there. We get our settings and so forth, tells us how long it's taking. I still am shocked with all of that back in the day. I can go ahead and zoom, and here's that alpha blended box, and I can go ahead and pick this, and we can drill in and even deeper and deeper. Well, now we're starting to get some fire looking stuff, and again, you find all the different patterns and capabilities that are visible in all of these things, and you can keep digging in until you find more and more structures, and it's really quite mesmerizing as you go through it. And you can find different values, like go by the corners up here, you get a lot more of the curly cues that are inside here. This one's kind of a cool one to show as you dig deeper and deeper. So great, this is that exploratory data visualization. Now let's take a look at what it looks like on the iOS side. I said the code is the same. It uses the exact same Mandelbrot generator. Well, let's run it on the simulator. Let's see what this looks like. So here we have the Mandel-Fire program running on the iOS simulator, the iPad, and it does everything exactly the same. I can still scan in, I can drop in and find the little imaging in there, drill in a little different. Oh, here we go, this should be a good one. Get some nice coloring, the firing, the backgrounds, and so forth. Still have all the same capabilities. Go ahead and click reset. It regenerates the image and goes back to the start. Palette's a little bit different because we don't have as many changes and capabilities there, but again, mobile application, I can run it on all my platforms, including the Mac itself as well. So those are all the examples that I have for today. There's a few resources, and this is by no means exhaustive. This is just a couple that I've highlighted here if you're looking for more. Designing Data Visualizations is a nice little book. It's rather short. It just gets to the point, gives you some guidelines, things to think about when you're trying to visualize data. Visual Explanations by Edward Tufte is a classic book about visualization techniques and a variety of industries, and not just computing. Wonderful read, just kind of good background information. And there's tons of websites. If you search, just data visualization, you'll find
tons of them. These are three that are pretty cool. They have some really neat examples. A lot of them tend to focus on taking large volumes of data, like Twitter messages, and then displaying them on a graph to see trends and what's hot and so forth. So it applies to all these kinds of things. I tended in this presentation to focus more on kind of some of the business aspects and the scientific side, but again, those same techniques apply to all of our computing. Here's my contact information. I appreciate the time you've taken to listen in and watch this webinar. I will be certainly answering any questions I can during the live portion of this, and thank you once again.
Certainly, first off, I appreciate the feedback that's been coming in through the questions. That's great. It's a very interesting topic, and it's such a large field of discipline and things that you can focus on, and I think that was probably one of the challenging pieces, is really narrowing it down to something where people can have some good value. And a couple of the questions kind of tied to that. One was the example regarding the list box in the iOS app and showing the data using the custom styles to represent very sophisticated items for that, and compare that with the new T-list view that's been included to really be optimized for large data sets and smooth scrolling. And the question was, can the same technique be used in the list view if I have a very large data set? And at this point, they really serve two different functions, and the list view items that are used inside of a T-list view are not stylable. The display capabilities, there are several things that you can do, but it doesn't use the same styling that you have available in the T-list box. So that is something you would have to kind of counteract to see if providing maybe some filtering capabilities to get the data set to be more manageable, if that was a concern. In general, now if I throw my user interface design hat on, I always have to ask, if we're looking at the mobile side and we're having a lot of data, we really should provide some ways to filter that down, because scrolling can be somewhat cumbersome. It's very intuitive using your fingers to scroll things, but if you've ever gone through a longer list of items, it tends to be a little bit harder to narrow it down because you get the acceleration, you end up over-scrolling. So the more we can do to filter and help our customers get to that particular subset of data we want, the better. So I hope that answers that one. There was a question about my tool palette, which I always like. Whenever I do conferences and things, people see that, it's like, well, what tool are you using to do that? And I said, nothing different. It's built into the box. For my component palette, all I use is the large icon size, and I turn off button captions. And so it allows me to see many more components and controls at one time than the default look. Bear in mind that it's most effective when you have icons that are very distinguishable. I mean, in some ways, you have the same principles of the data visualization that apply to that. So when you can recognize what you're looking for with an image, finding it inside that list is great. Sometimes, some of the imaging may not be obvious, so you might have a little bit more trouble. Let's see what else we have here. I've never used visually created style layout. Do we simply drop a style container on the form? Yeah, that's basically where you start. It's called a T-style book. It's on the main first component page. And there have certainly been some sessions. I know I cover it in detail in any of my component writing ones. And my original plan, if I had more time, was to show the actual creation of the two ratings components that I had built. And of course, that will be included in all the source code that's provided with all of this. But to create a new style, it really starts out with the style book. However, what I like to say, or to get people started with it, if they're not really familiar with the styles, is to actually just create a form. If you start out with a FireMonkey desktop app with an HD form, you have a designer surface that you're used to using, and you still have all the primitives. So if you think about the first example that I had used where I showed the vector graphics and primitives, start playing around with those. If you drop down a T layout, T layout is a really cool control. The easiest way to think about it is it's a T panel without the overhead. So there's no baggage, there's no display capabilities, it's just to group things together. And so it's very lightweight. Drop a layout on the form and start putting controls into that layout to get an idea of what you can do with your style. Now, what's neat about it is that the layout that you create in that form file is what you would do for a style. So much so you can actually take those elements and put them into your style book, and it will work. But that's a good way to get started with it. Once you have that available, now you can put them into a style book and then give it a style name, which you can then look up using the find style resource method, as I showed in all the examples, to locate that and then apply it into your particular code. But you can also just take a control and right-click it and select Edit Custom Style. This is also on your form, and it'll jump you into there, and you can modify one example. Let's see what else we have here. How does the runtime library get handled on different platforms? That's a great question. I was trying to illustrate a little bit of that, talking about the T stopwatch. And there's two basic approaches when it comes to the platform support. One, you have standard RTL, runtime library functions that we're familiar with. We've had them in Delphi since the beginning. And those have been reworked and redesigned to support the multiple platforms. And so you'll find it's also kind of ties into the whole unit scope names that have been added. All the different things like sysutils is now part of system. And so those things have been designed to be cross-platform now. So whether they handle it internally with compiler defines and so forth, it really doesn't matter. It could be completely implemented separately, but it's encapsulated from us, so we just use the same functions we're used to using. On the other side, there may be services that are available that are common, but there's either they're new or there's a new wrapper around those, and those are all encapsulated into the platform capability. So there's a new platform namespace that encapsulates a services structure, if you will, and you can request that if a given service is available. And so there's one to access the orientation or the orientation services of your mobile devices. Obviously, that wouldn't be available necessarily on your desktop Windows app. You can get access to keyboards, custom services that an operating system provides, and all of those also handle the different variations between the platforms. The cool thing is that as a developer with the FM application framework, we just code to the RTL. We don't have to worry about dealing with that. Other than if a service isn't available, we have to not consider going further. All right, what else do we have here? So general, is there any possibility of electronic future in this field? Is there any possibility of electrical engineers' future progress in this field? Absolutely. I don't see any reason why in the field in general would be limited to any particular discipline. We're constantly looking at visualizing data, whether it is on a programmatic side that we're writing the programs and software to actually present data to our users and do it in an automated way, or whether we're in some other discipline that is utilizing the same techniques to do that. We could be, an accountant presenting information to our staff on new tax codes. And if you don't present that data in a convenient way, there's really, you're missing, some great opportunities. So in this field, I don't think you're limited at all. Let's see what else we've got going on here. Have you started to use Google Drive, shift data from one user to another? That's interesting. I did receive another question, I guess, for the conference that was referring to the Google Drive, and I had come across a little bit of it during some of my research, and a lot of some of the visualizations that they have built into there, where you can create some of your own and get access to some data. I personally have not delved into any depth with respect to that. It did look interesting on the surface. So I really can't comment on what's really involved in moving it from one to the other. It definitely does look interesting and kind of more a way to provide some quick ways of accessing data. I did like the fact that they did kind of categorize the different visualizations that are there, that are available, so that was intriguing. The other question that I had seen had to deal with accessing the visualizations or utilizing them inside of Delphi and DFM framework, and there's from what I can gather, there is an API that's available, but it wasn't real obvious, and I didn't have enough time to really research it in depth as to whether we could leverage some of that if it was a callable interface other than a scripting engine. It definitely seemed to be more driven from a web-based solution rather than a desktop app calling REST services and things like that. Perhaps the data is accessible, and then we would be simply using our own data visualization techniques to get at that data. We can certainly do that. Or that could be looked into going into the future. Let's see what else we got. Well, here was an interesting one. How would you keep the title bar in place in the ratings app at the top of the screen? And I interpreted that as meaning the header bar. Since the title, which had food processors on it, was always there, but it was a good observation because as I scrolled the list, the header moved up with the list data, which may or may not be what you want it to do. One way to that if you always wanted the header to be available is to actually use a second list box. And so if you imagine it's all on a form, they're small size, I could align the first list box to the top, and it would have just the header and the title. So the title bar would still be there. The header would be just a single list item that was added to it, and would have the appropriately styled header item. Then when the second list box would be the aligned client at the bottom, which would have the item data. And so in that case, you would scroll the top list, or the bottom list, and not the top one, and your header would always be visible. So you might have to look into that. It's a nice little adjustment there. Always looking at the iterative look at all of this works really well. Let's see what else we've got here. Are bar charts part of infographics? They certainly can be. One of the things that's very interesting is when you talk about the infographics, and I was trying to kind of convey some of that, but the principal techniques are pretty much all the same. You can have graphs and tables and even spreadsheets and maps and so forth that are part of an infographic. The real difference is that an infographic is very stylized for the particular set of data that is being looked at. And so you may see a lot of ancillary artistic work that is added to the traditional pie chart. A great example is if you search for USA Today snapshots, you will see an example of what I would consider bar chart infographics. Now, most of them are bar charts, and there's a number of pie charts as well that fall into that, but they are specifically designed for one set of data. And so they have pictorial representations, they've got some background imaging, or if you're talking about crop production in the U.S., you may see an icon of corn versus wheat inside of each bar of the bar chart. So it's stylized to help convey more information. So an answer it is, but it's not limited to just infographics. Will the code examples be made available? Absolutely. All of the code that's included, including the components, the ratings components, will all be included in the source download that will be made available as soon as I package all of that up to Embarcadero and they can make it available to all the attendees. But yeah, everything will be included. My examples were all in Delphi, but the same principles apply to C++ Builder and the FM framework. There's nothing that was specifically tied to the Delphi language in this. The principles of styles works the same. All of that gets leveraged away. The same manipulation with the bitmap data is also the same in all of those. Can you give an example which is an infographic and not part of data visualization? Well, all of this, the USA Today snapshots are a quick example of what I would consider infographics that rather than traditional data visualizations. However, the way the question's worded, infographics by its very nature is essentially a subset of visualizing data. And I did change the order of that specifically. So when we're talking about visualizing data, there's essentially two schools of thought. There's one, I want to have a more generic way to present data that handles a large volume of data sets. It has, I'm trying to convey usually larger volumes of data, and that would fall under the umbrella of data visualization or information visualization. Then on the other side is that I have a much smaller set of data that I'm interested in. I'm designing it not for necessarily consumption or for exploring, but I'm actually using it to convey information. And so I have a smaller set of data. I'm working with one particular set of data, and even a very restricted set. I'm looking at revenues generated by a company for this month, and I'm not trying to worry about the whole year or the whole history of things. I'm refining it, and I end up really enhancing the visual impact of it. So it becomes more of a graphic arts project than a visualization or a data visualization tool. And so what I like to do to make the distinction is if I'm making a PowerPoint slide or a poster or a billboard, I'm probably focused on an infographic approach. I want it visually impactful. I want to manage the amount of data so I'm not overwhelming my UI. I am making things easily understandable at a glance. So by very nature, those same principles can apply to a software program when I'm looking and I start talking about dashboards. If I'm looking at a dashboard or a control panel, I don't want to overwhelm the user with lists of data. I want that summary, that quick, impactful view. Now I can give them another way to dig in further, dig in deeper. Then I'm switching from an infographics approach into a data visualization approach. One of the things, there was a comment made about, I had the simulator just pop up apparently on the Windows desktop in my video, and I am running on a Mac to do this. It's really the easiest way to do the development is I have a MacBook that I use to do the development where Windows is all running inside of a VM. And I personally use Parallels, but a lot of people will use Fusion from VMware. It allows you to have a nice, consistent interface, and I just have a network between the VM and my MacBook to all of the debugging and the testing. And you can still do the same thing. You need to have, if you want to do it to your real device, you plug in your real device to your MacBook, and then Delphi goes through and executes all the command line codes to sign the application and deploy it onto your device, your test device. So it's a pretty decent tool chain process that goes through to get that to work. Another really good question that came up was when I was customizing the progress bar in the list example, and I wanted to give it a new style. And I've made a comment about how it was important that I named my style a certain way, specifically H indicator and H track. And the question was, well, how do I find out about those? What are those contracts that have been established by a control that already has a style? if I wanted to customize it. And unfortunately, there's no single repository of all that information. Really, it comes down to the source. If you do have the source, you do with the FireMonkey framework, you can look through either the FMX standard controls or the FMX controls units and extract out what styles are being used. Another option is to right-click on a control on a form designer and edit a custom style. And from there, you can go and see all the styles that are being used in that control. The problem is you just have a list of styles. You don't know the purpose or what the code is accessing in order to make changes. And that's where you end up having to go to the source code to get that information. Some other questions that came up. There was the topic of animated visualizations. Somebody had asked about that. I didn't have any time to dig into any depth for this webinar. It's an interesting topic. Again, it's another variation. Rather than look at just static imaging, going into seeing the transitions that occur. And there's a whole set of guidelines that come into play when you talk about that, because you have to make sure that your animation sequence is representative of the data changes that are actually taking place. Because based on how you do the animation or the transitions, you can actually introduce a bias to the interpretation of the data. A classic example is if you watch your local weather stations and you're seeing weather patterns come in and they show the time-lapse photography. And if you were to not have a linear approach for that, or if you were to vary it to try to speed up over the course of the day, you can make it look as though weather patterns are moving in an unrealistic manner. And so the same happens even with whether any type of data that you're going to animate over the time series. You have to have some considerations for that. So perhaps a future webinar we can investigate more of that topic in depth. Let's see. There was early on there was several questions regarding my emphasis of the vector-based controls, and then how does that compare with bitmap rendering and things of that nature, and what are the trade-offs between those? And there's actually several. Some of you who've been working with FireMonkey for a while may have realized or remembered that the original version, all of the rendering was done in vector-based graphics. And there's definitely some benefits to that, but what people found was it didn't quite look right on the given platform. It wasn't leveraging the platform's adornments for what controls look like. So buttons were a little bit different, and other elements, your title bars and the headers and things like that weren't quite the same. And so one of the big emphasis was to switch to bitmap rendering for certain controls, which is great because it gives a much more native look and feel to the applications that are being written. However, you can temper that with when you're talking about the client area, the information you're showing, and you want to take advantage of the vector-based scalable power of controls. That's where the leverage comes in. So if you are doing diagramming, you really want to use vector graphics for that because you get the benefit for the anti-aliasing between all the different shapes and things that you have, the lines that are drawn. All of that is built into the framework itself. Can you do the same thing, with a straight bitmap rendering of pixels on the device? Absolutely. It all comes down to canvas at some point, a device context if you're running on Windows. A quartz display if you're running on the Mac side of things. And it just depends on how much of the capability is provided by the framework, and that's where the FM framework provides a lot of benefit. Because all that's built in and thrown off to the GPU to work on performance issues and things like that to speed all that up. If I looked at the possibilities of path gradients, I have not dug into much depth into that. There's quite a bit you can do with the gradients that are already in there. The T-gradient class is quite flexible once you understand how to use it. One of the oddest things about that is when you want to specify your directional angle where you want the gradient to go, you end up using essentially rectangular coordinates to do that. And so once you get the hang of, okay, if I have my starting point and my ending point, and that allows me to specify essentially a vector, which from there can determine my angle. And the zero angle is from left to right horizontal. And so if you remember that in any of that, all the FireMonkey stuff is based on that. So rotational angles all start with horizontal line going off left to right. But for the path gradients, it's interesting. It definitely could be used and leveraged in a lot of different ways, not something I've really dug into at this point. Someone had asked about performance comparison on bitmap manipulations in FireMonkey compared to Graphics 32. Unfortunately, I haven't done any head-to-head comparisons with that. I'm not sure if anybody else has. They might be available for review. From the bitmap manipulation side, and certainly looking at the shading filters and the capabilities with that, I've seen really good responses from that for what I've been able to do. One of the things I anticipated doing, given some more time, and I may still extend it, looking at the Mandalfire app, was I wanted to blend the current viewport into the next viewport. And so my intention, and still may get around to do it, is to use the shader to go from the current view into the new one, which should be relatively straightforward, because that's one of the reasons why I do all the calculations in an offline bitmap. So being able to do that, having the offline bitmap, it's not causing flicker, everything's generated in the background, and then I could blend that in with the foreground image to fade into the next zoom level. So very powerful capabilities with respect to the bitmap manipulation. The key thing, as an aside with respect to that, is that you may also see a lot of references to bitmap surface. T-bitmap surface class is it's essentially a lightweight bitmap data. It has all the information about the bitmap data. It's got the pixels, it's got the scan lines, and so forth. It doesn't have all the extra features like being able to rotate it and so forth. It's used as a support class. Whenever you specify a particular pixel format, you can now use that to do the file saving and loading, and so it uses this lightweight class to do that. And at one point, I ended up having the whole Mandelbrot generator doing it in a bitmap surface, and it worked just fine. However, because I knew I was going to try to get to this transition phase, that I ended up keeping it at the bitmap side. Next question is, do you have any examples using maps or a globe? I don't have anything that I've pre-canned for presentation inside this at the moment. I've done some coding to some of the mapping things on the iOS side. More or less, that's kind of navigational side or location-based, rather than doing more, I would call, data visualization, having multiple points of data and having that distributed over. But again, that's one of the challenges with data visualization. There are so many different areas that it covers. You kind of have to pick and choose. So I could certainly see another round of these, in several months further, as we see more and more capabilities come up, more and more suggestions come in, and we can keep drilling deeper and deeper in different ways that we can visualize our data. That's a great suggestion. All right, what would you say dictates whether you should keep using styles versus creating custom component to handle the visualization, such as your Mandelbrot generator? Well, I'm going to break this up into two questions. The first being kind of when you decide is too much styling enough? And I tend to use the same rules of thumb, the guidelines, that I use when I decide whether to make any kind of custom component, whether or not it's specifically to handle styling, or if it's for things that if I'm using just any control, whether it's VCL or FireMonkey, and I'm constantly changing the same sets of properties, or I'm trying to get a certain look and feel, and I need to reproduce that in multiple applications, those are great candidates for making into a custom control. What's nice about the FireMonkey controls is because I can include a style and even multiple styles. If you think about it, my rating icon, I can do that with any type of icon representation that I want. It doesn't have to be just those 5. They're all separate styles that the component knows how to switch between. And it's very similar to what FireMonkey does right now with the style lookup editors, where you have all these different pre-built styles and you can connect to. So it's quite a powerful way to get some reuse without having to hand tweak the styles. So if you do come up with a style that you want to use multiple times, that is a good candidate to make into a custom control. Or at a minimum, define the style and save it to a style file. You can do that inside the style designer. And then have a repository of style settings that you can load up. Now, the problem, that's equivalent to the old component templates in Delphi, if any of you guys remember those. That was a mechanism to capture the current settings that you made to a control, save it off to a persistent store, and then when you brought it back in, it reproduced all the steps for you. The problem with that is if you go and change one, if you wanted something different, well, none of the other instances get changed. It's all disconnected. So there's a lot of power for putting things into components. Tying it back to the second part of this was the question regarding the Mandelbrot generator. The styling in that was pretty straightforward. There was a little bit of styling that was done for the panel, for the sidebar, added a gradient. It really wasn't necessary to put any of that into a custom control. Could I put the Mandelbrot generator itself into a custom control? Certainly. That is an interesting idea. You could take, it wouldn't necessarily have any styles in it. It's really going to be probably a descendant of the paint box or an image control. And because its whole purpose would be to display the current version of the viewport and have more of that built into that. But then the question is, okay, am I going to use Mandelbrot generator in multiple applications? Maybe not. It may be a little bit more overhead than I need to worry about. Yeah, so the next question was in regards to, again, the styles and wanting to learn more about them and handling them. And yes, the source code does include all of the styles and the style book settings that are used in all the examples. So you can certainly dig through that. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm happy to help and help promote this. That's it. How long do you expect something like ratings free application would take an average dollar to create, start, and end, including this research experimentation necessary? That's an interesting question. I guess as itself, the Ratings 3 app is fairly straightforward. It's really a simple view. It's just looking at one set of data. Obviously, there'd be more work to be done to make it something what I would call production ready, beyond just illustrating some of the techniques. So obviously, you take some more time. But the basic principle of adding items to a list from a client data set is really straightforward. The challenge is really the incorporation of the stylings and then the addition of the components, because you have to create all of those and then bring that in. One of our challenges, and this is a great opportunity for webinars like this, is to help disseminate, spread this information to developers so that even anyone can see that, okay, now that I know what to do, this is very approachable. It's getting over that initial hurdle of all that's available. Which way do you solve it? So certainly wish you best of luck continuing with that. Do you have any component that will analyze a set of data and draw contours? Well, that's an interesting question, and I can certainly see where some of that would be applicable. I don't personally, and I'm not aware of one that is. Perhaps someone out there is working on something along those lines. It's interesting because you end up having to constrain it quite a bit when you start trying to generally interpret or analyze any kind of data. And so that's literally the biggest challenge is, okay, what do you give it to bound it so that you're not just seeing a garbled mess of data? What do you do with outliers and things like that that start to distort and misinterpret it? But certainly you could do that using all the capabilities that are in the framework. Let's see here. I was trying to follow your display styles and looking at existing code, but lost track of how to get to what you were saying. It's impossible to quick summary or a link to a resource covering how to do this. Kevin, I would go ahead and send me an email, and I can certainly walk through some of the steps better. One of the things where another great resource is my Creating FireMonkey Components webinars for Code Rage. I've done those the last couple of times. They're a lot of the style support is, I describe that because it's so crucial to how to work that. And that might be a really good reference to go through to walk and understand how the styles fit, how we include them. Because one of the examples I start with is I create a simple form, drop a control down, and customize its style and describe how that works. So that would be my reference for the best way to get more information on that. Oh, and thank you, Kevin, for the comment regarding the Mandelbrot code example and the use of the canvas and multiple device. I appreciate the feedback for that. It was fun in a number of different ways, although it did present some challenges. As I kind of tried to emphasize, the canvas, while quite powerful, is different than the BCL side of things, and so it really takes some time to understand how to start manipulating data if we want to start doing some image processing. What I really want to do, and may end up doing it before the code is submitted, is include the shading, the shade effects that are part of FireMonkey to do image transitions. One of the things I really had hoped to have done before the webinar was as the background generator created the new viewport image, because all that's done in its own bitmap, the UI stays active. Well, when it's done generating, blend the new to the old and transition it through, which FireMonkey makes really straightforward to accomplish that. And that's a wonderful technique of transitioning from one to the other. And so I appreciate the feedback.
Well, thank you everyone again for joining us, and Ray, thanks so much for helping us out and doing such a fabulous job.
Well, thank you, and you're very welcome.